everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and this is episode 27, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, part 1. As we continue to look at the players involved in the Bible and prophecy, both past and future, and how that affects us today, we're going to talk about a very important set of characters, the four horsemen that come out in Revelation 6. And this is one of those topics that is endlessly debated, endlessly speculated upon as to who are these four horsemen, and we're going to cover off who they are, at least sort of generically speaking in terms of understanding what type of being that they are. And when is the timing of the introduction of these four horsemen of the apocalypse? And what is the meaning to the imagery of the allegory? And there's a million different kinds of translations, interpretations, and understanding of it. And it's important that we get a good framework as to who these players are and what they mean, and what we can look forward to then in terms of how end time prophecy is going to unfold. And as we contemplate that, we need to be aware of the spurious forces who use an interpretive approach, and they manipulate the meaning to anything that they want it to mean. And it's a changing, evolving thing, because that's the interpretive nature of the polytheists and Gnostics in particular. And they're going to assign the mystical meanings hidden underneath, according to their belief system, as to the events that are happening in the end time, all to mislead Christians away from God, away from Jesus, and to put doubt in their minds and to deceive them into worshiping and joining the religion of Babylon, the New World Order, and then eventually even to worshiping the Antichrist and taking the mark of the beast. So we need to understand that the interpretive forces are there to lead you astray. And I come to that sort of conclusion because they are on the other side of the table. They are the enemy. They are the ones that are denying God. And so they are going to use all of these kinds of tactics to deceive Christians in particular. So how do we arm ourselves about that? How do we protect ourselves? And if you've been watching any of my shows, and if you haven't, maybe go back and listen to some of them, and particularly with all of the players that we're talking about and some of the other prophetic shows that we've did on the tribulation and the birth pangs. It'll give you a better feel for how I approach prophecy. And I won't go through everything today, but I will just sort of underline that the first thing that we're going to do to ensure that we're not being deceived and we're getting the chronology and the meaning correct is we're going to place all prophecy around what Jesus says first, and not vice versa. We won't apologize for what Jesus said. We won't say that he wasn't really saying what he actually said he said. We're just going to let Jesus guide us through prophecy with the chronology that he laid out in the order that he laid it out, so that we can fit all other prophecy around that. And when you do that, you don't have any issues with the linear nature to prophecy, particularly as it's related to Revelation, which is linear. I know there's a lot of teachings that says it isn't. And you're going to understand that the chronology will start to all of a sudden fit together, and particularly with Revelation and other prophecies that people tend to just look at in a, I would say, narrow lens, a narrow focus, and then leave out inconvenient passages that don't fit their particular contrived conclusion or preconceived conclusion. And so we also want to include all of the prophecies, and we can't do that in this show, but all of the end time chronology scenarios have to fall into line, and they can't conflict. So you have to use all of them, all of the verses, and they have to fit. And if you get one that's out of whack, then you have to relook. And that's going to always let you be learning. But the more you do this, the less you'll have to adjust. And of course, when we look at the linear nature, the Bible is linear, and so is Revelations, and so is Jesus' oration in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 17 and 21. He is giving you events in order so that you can understand it. And so if we put our faith in Jesus, we're going to be okay with this, and we're going to start fitting things together. And we're going to be able to help other people, which is really, really important. So let's move on to the timing and the chronology, and also underline that when there is allegory, and we're going to have some allegory in the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we're going to define all of that allegory within the Bible, so that we have a consistency to test what we're doing, and that it doesn't run contrary to other prophecies. So again, all of that has to fit. So when we look at the timing and the chronology of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that start in chapter 6 of Revelation and ending in about verse 9, as I recall. This is following a scenario that precedes chapter 6, which is what I kind of look at as the throne scenario, the heavenly scenario, where we're getting some players put into place. The vision for John is being set. And then after all of that is explained, we get the introduction of the four horsemen. So after what's going on in heaven, and then just before the timing will be just before the signing of the covenant that future Antichrist will negotiate, that is talked about in Daniel 9:27. So just before that as well. So before the last 7 years. We're going to talk about a possibility here in terms of how much before the four horsemen come out that might be. But we need to understand that it is part of the birth pangs and the chronology that we're going to come back to later in the show that Jesus lays out. So you'll understand very quickly that the events and the things coming together sort of depend on us understanding that this is likely pre-last 7 years, but not that much before. And so if we go to Revelation 2, when we're introduced to, all of the churches, and the second church is the church of Smyrna, you need to have a close look at a couple of things that are going on in the church of Smyrna. And it's got obviously the satanic Jews are in there, and the synagogue of Satan, and this is important. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's in the same scenario. And I'm going to focus on verses 9 and 10 for this church of poverty, and the church that is offered an olive branch of salvation for being true. And when we look at verses 9 and 10, we're introduced to the concept that they are going to receive 10 days to be tried and 10 days of tribulation. This is a very interesting term, the 10 days. And so typically days can be interpreted literally as days, or they can be interpreted as prophetic years, just as you get the 70 weeks of years in Daniel, this is just preceding that last week of years. So 7 years would be, or 7 days would be 7 years, and now we're looking at a possibility of 10 days as opposed to being just 24-hour period. So if we look at that as being a prophetic year, then we're showing 10 years of tribulation and trying for the church of Smyrna, the poor poverty church. And when we look at the word tried, so that people have a clear understanding what it's being talked about, this means to suffer, to be persecuted, to be tested, to prove your faith, to be tempted. And all of this is going to be happening with all that's going on as we have a rising Babylon. And of course, tribulation is thalipsis. I always struggle with that word, thalipsis, which is the same word used for persecution and affliction, just as Jesus is going to talk about the affliction, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, of the first 3.5 years. This is a tribulation that's going on before the beginning of the last 7 years. And so we see this coming up also as a term that's related to the time of trouble, of Jacob's trouble, and the time of trouble in Daniel, which is the second half of the tribulation. So we've got the two tribulations that I've covered off previously, but we're going to see rising persecution that isn't defined as these two tribulations that I've talked about, but there's going to be persecution even before the start of the last 7 years, which is really going to catch people off guard. So we need to be prepared for that. And so if we look at the horsemen that are coming out of the throne area, and it's before the last 7 years, and we understand that we're going to have a rising Babylon, which is the universal church, then what we're going to see is there's going to be significant turnover, significant trouble as Babylon is rising, and yet we don't even have the negotiated covenant yet. And this is going to be the time of Babylon and conquest. And we're going to get to what that means in terms of the four horsemen right now, because this is one of the most important things that we need to understand, because you have the four horses and the four different colors with four different meanings, but the one that people focus on the most, that is most speculated on and most debated, is the white horse. And the white horse has a rider on it. And we need to understand who this rider is, but let's understand the allegory first of the white horse. And the white horse comes out with a bow and a crown to conquer and to conquest. So this is about setting up the end time New World Order, which is going to be fulfilled with the 10 king empire of the last time, the 10 trading blocks, the 10 spheres of influence, the 10 groups of nations, the 10 empires of the last time that Antichrist in Daniel 9:27 is going to negotiate. Most people think then that this is going to be done through conquering and Antichrist conquering. And although this is all around the rise of Antichrist, with the time of the rise of Babylon, it's not the time of Antichrist. That comes at the midpoint of the last 7 years when he's conquered. And he won't even be all that famous, I don't think, at this point in time. I think he'll catch people off guard. So he's given a bow and a crown. So what does that mean? And I think that's at the key is what's going to happen in terms of this conquest. So bow is the Greek word toxin 5115. And it doesn't tell us a lot until we start connecting it to a couple other dots. And it means a simple fabric. And it's from 5086, which means, bring forth or give birth. So something about a simple fabric, which typically in the modern world doesn't mean anything, but we'll come back to this in a second. The second word is crown. Oh, and just sticking with bow for a second, most people think it means a weapon of war, just as it's been used throughout history. But in this application, and it's only used once in the Bible with this word toxin specifically for the garment as the meaning comes out, it's not a weapon of war. So it's a fabric, and we need to understand it that way and then weave that into the meaning. The second word is crown. And this is not an ordinary crown. This is the Greek word Stephanos. And it means figuratively a crown, but literally a crown that is a wreath. And we understand this in history as in the Olympic Games, that athletes were in prehistory, when they won events, were awarded a crown and crowned with a wreath. And this is the same wreath that is on the UN flag and UN organizations. This is the laurel wreath that I think that they're talking about. And the laurel wreath has a history that goes back into Greek mythology, back to Apollo and Daphne. And Daphne escapes Apollo and turns herself into is turned into a laurel tree. And that's why you have the laurel tree as the laurel Daphne as sort of the botanical name. And Apollo makes a wreath out of one of the branches or the browse or burrows of the laurel tree, and this becomes his crown that he's associated with and is very, very popular in Greek and Roman history. And what's really interesting as well about this laurel wreath is that it is also a badge recognizing royalty and bloodlines. And this is the laurel tree that grows quite commonly in the Lorraine region of France, where the Anjou, Plantagenet, and de Bouillon families, founders of the Knights Templar and descendants of Dagobert, the last surviving member of the Merovingians, and their Nephilim bloodlines and other Scion bloodlines that they have grafted in from David and Saul, and even in, if you're familiar with the Da Vinci Code, they have a belief that they have Jesus is a Mary Magdalene's bloodline grafted in as well. So look for that as part of the deception as well, in terms of that's false, but they're going to provide evidence that is going to try and convince people otherwise. And so we have, in terms of this crown that he's going to wear a crown that is a laurel wreath, and of the bloodlines of the Nephilim that we need to underline on. So he's going to have a pedigree. And he's going to have a bow or a simple fabric. And if we look at Greek gods in history in terms of how they're depicted, and particularly Apollo, he's depicted with a white, simple fabric gown, robe, however you want to put it, with a laurel wreath. And I think this is the type of imagery that we may want to be expecting. And a fabric in Greek mythology goes back to the Greek fates, who have the fabric and the threads of destiny and hold the destiny of the world in their hands. And so all of this is intermixed into Greek mythology that I think is going to be mixed into the pedigree of the rider on the white horse that is going to be the one that will stir up things for the Antichrist to surface. And he's probably going to accept this robe and this laurel wreath. And what's interesting about Apollo, that's the same set of words in Greek that Apollyon comes from. And the son of perdition goes back to. And I've made those connections in the past. So now I want you to understand that this is going to be, again, part of that imagery that they're going to have for the pedigree and the heritage of this individual claiming to be Jesus, who is going to be on a march very shortly after he negotiates the covenant of death in Daniel 9:27, and I know the covenant of death comes up in Isaiah, but it's the same covenant, and people need to understand that, because Isaiah 27 and 28, where you get this covenant of death, that's this river that comes out that happens in Revelation 12 when the covenant is annulled at the 3.5-year point when Antichrist takes power. Don't have time to go into that today, but just understand that there's a connection here and there's a trail to follow that we can define in the Bible, and look for the polytheists who are going to be promoting this individual to build on that from their traditions. So the second horse is the red horse, and it takes peace from the world. And this is part of the birth pangs and the wars, and this is still previous to, or before, I should say, the start of the last 7 years, which starts with negotiation done by Antichrist to create this new world order of these 10 kings. And so we need to understand that they're given a sword, and there's going to be 25% of the people destroyed within the wars and the consequences that come from war that is going to put the world into complete turmoil. And again, in Revelation 6, it's so bad that we learn at the end of Revelation 6 that a lot of people think that this was the day of the Lord in Armageddon. But it's just part of the birth pangs, but it's ramping up to the first level. And understand the trumpets are 33% and the wrath bowls are 100%, except Jesus steps in to shorten those days, or all would be destroyed. All humans. So we need to understand that this is the wars that are going to be going on that is going to allow Babylon to step in as this universal religion, with their prophets saying, if you do not convert to this religion, we will be destroyed from the face of the earth through wars and other things, whether it's nuclear holocaust, whether or not it's through other disasters. And that's how we start to see some of the connections, are the other disasters where you have famine and pestilence and disease that is going to be part of the consequences of war. And of course, the third horse, which is the black horse, is the horse that's going to describe famine and food shortages because of the destruction. There won't be enough food. People will work for one day for a day's amount of food in terms of calories, or however they're going to measure that out. They've got balances there that it's going to be weighed out, that you can have just enough to survive a day. And the fourth horse is the pale horse of death. Because when you have wars, you're going to get famine and you're also going to get diseases, just as when you have earthquakes, and you're going to have death. And so it follows that you're going to have the fourth horse, which is the pale horse of death. And we also have the earthquakes, just as you get this great earthquake in Revelation 6. And again, that is part of all of this destruction and part of the birth pangs, but getting stronger. So you've had all of these before. They're getting more intense, and now we're into the significant part of the intensity as we're approaching the last 7 years, because this makes the way for Antichrist and the start of the last 7 years. And we also notice in Revelation 6:9, as we're looking for the timing, is we have the first fruits. And these first fruits are those who have been killed in the name of Jesus since the timing of Jesus. So these are Christian saints, part of the first fruits, part of the elders whenever they were raised beforehand, probably at the time of Jesus or just before this point, but they're in heaven before John goes there in vision to start it in chapters 1 through 5. And they're told to wait for the balance of the first fruits, who are going to be killed like they are in the tribulation, which starts as the first tribulation and are shown in Revelation 7. So again, you see how the chronology is fitting, and this is the tribulation that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, 7 through 9. And we're going to sort of summarize that at the beginning, or at the end of this show, so that you see how that firmly fits in. So you have a tribulation before the start of the last 7, a tribulation that gets worse in the first 3.5 years, the reign of Babylon, and then when Antichrist takes power, you have the second tribulation, which is worse than all that has come before. So, having laid that down, let's talk about who these writers are. And in Revelations verses 6, verses 2 through 8, you have the writers that are referred to as he or him. So it's a pronoun, and that comes from G846, which is the word autos or otos, depending on how you want to pronounce that, but autos as we would in English, and it's a reflexive pronoun that is sort of reflecting back on who the writer is, and as in being a baffling wind. And it is rooted in this autos word is rooted in G109 with his ahayr, Ahayr, ahayr. However, I might butcher some of these words, but I'll give you the pronunciation when I do. Also meaning breath, wind, and air. So what we do know is these riders aren't humans. They are coming with a purpose from the throne that has something to do with prophecy and bringing about events. So there's some kind of spirit being from heaven, and spirit beings are the home of angels and God, the home of the spirit beings. So it makes sense that they're being described this way. And so Revelation 6 is telling us that they're likely angels. And so when we look at a companion set of prophecies to understand this, we need to go to Zechariah and the four chariots. And in Zechariah, 3 through 12 in chapter 6, you have four chariots, and they are white and red and black, just as we're being described in Revelation 6, and grizzled, which means bay or spotted, and which is more of the pale horse. And again, each of these four chariots with their horses have a rider. And at the end of that, as you get into verse 12, this is going to lead into the time of the branch who comes in the end time to build the new temple, which is going to be in the millennium. This is the time of Jesus' coming. So that's still before, but all of this leads to it. But Zechariah tells us more about these riders, and I think they're the same riders. And in Zechariah 6:5, we're told that they are the four spirits that go from standing before God, just as the four horsemen come from standing before God. So very important and consistent in terms of the prophetic understanding and allegory of who these beings are as angel beings that come from the throne of God. And when we look at the word spirit, that comes from 7307 ruach, which means breath, wind, so similar meaning, Holy Spirit, spirit, and angel spirit being. And also for the spirit of prophecy, which is also significant in the understanding of these four spirits and the four riders. And these are the four spirits of the heavens. Shemaim, heavens. I am. So you've got three heavens. You've got the firmament, you've got the physical universe outside the firmament, and then you have the spirit world, as Corinthians talks about in terms of the three heavens. And the spirit world is where these spirits reside. So all the imagery is coming to fruition. And this is the universe is the abode of the heavens are the abode of the stars, which is another allegory for angels. So these are angelic type of beings that are associated with prophecy and are very, very similar to the horses in Revelation, but they have prophetic implications that happen beforehand. And we're going to run a little bit more than the regular 30 minutes today to get this story in. So be patient. It's going to run a little bit longer, but I think the information is going to be worthwhile to you. So when we look at these four spirits of heaven, as we're moving into the end time, we need to understand that these are the four winds, just as the four horsemen are a baffling wind, just as Ruach can be a wind. These are the four winds of empires and prophecy and calamities. They are the ones sent forth by God to bring about or release the forces of evil to bring about the events of prophecy. And so when we look back in history, in Daniel 7:2, we get the four winds of the empires that blow on the sea to bring the world empires forward. And those are typically understood as Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the end time empire that comes out of Rome is the fifth. And 5 of the 7 represented in Revelation 13 and 17 that come out of the sea, that these 4 winds are released in Revelation to allow to bring about. So you see how the imagery is coming together. And so the other 2 empires traditionally understood in Daniel 7 are Assyria, that goes back to Babel, which is the imagery for the Babylon part of the religion, where the religion rose, and also part of an archetypical figure of an antichrist with Nimrod at Babel. And you see imagery again coming in perfectly, and then Egypt would be the other to make 7. Daniel 8 has these 4 winds as it brings about the 4 notable ones and the downfall of Alexander, and again fulfilling prophecy. And we're going to have in part 2 more of how these 4 winds participate in prophecy, but understand that the 4 notable ones are the 4 divisions of the empire. So now you have Alexander is 1, the 4 split is 5, Rome comes out of it as part of the Greek Empire is 6, the extended empire is 7 at the end time. And so this understanding of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 matches up with Daniel 2. And we need to factor in both of those prophecies and the imagery and understand how they're consistent, because it is seemingly telling us that Antichrist is going to come out of Greek and Roman Empire, just as we factor in this laurel wreath. So we should be looking for perhaps that part of the empire, but I don't want to make too specific of a prediction on that. I'm just sort of looking at what the imagery is telling us. And these are the empires, the beast empires from the sea, as it comes out in the end. That's a hydra that Michael fights against and then stops fighting at the crowning of Antichrist at the midpoint of the last 7 years, as he prepares for the angelic war that's going to come about, because he has permitted the end time empire to be usurped by Antichrist at the 3.5 year point. So again, we see allegory, chronology, all lining up perfectly. And so Antichrist is going to be raised by these 4 winds, and that's why you have the conquest of the bow and the crown in Revelation 6. So it's the 4 winds of prophecy that are going out, the 4 winds of empires, and they've been affecting prophecy throughout our time frame just by releasing and permitting evil to do what it wants to do, the spurious forces. And so let's bring this now back to what Jesus was talking about in terms of his chronology, because we understand that these 4 winds are 4 angels, and they are going to play a significant part, just as, and I'll just backtrack just a second here, you have in Revelation 7:1, right after Revelation 6 in terms of the chronology, 4 angels of winds that are going to be in play. And I think this has got a close association to the 4 winds of prophecy, because without the winds blowing, you're going to create these significant issues of famine and pestilence and disasters, which is going to lead to that war and that upheaval. So I think that's, again, all stuff that is going on just before and then into the start of the last 7 years. So when we look at what Jesus said then, he gave us a few things. That first of all, it's going to be like the days of Noah, and that follows all of the signs that were given beforehand. So we need to look for those relationships, and the fig tree generation, that all of these signs that are talked about before 24:32, Matthew 24:32 take place. And I think the fig tree generation starts with the capture of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is part of almost all end time prophecy, and that happened in 1967. What we don't know, is it 70 years, or is it 40 years, or is it 120 years, but it's certainly not 40 years if Jerusalem is this start of the countdown of the last generation. And then Matthew 24:6 and 7, we get the wars and the famine and the pestilence and the earthquakes as part of the birth pangs that will increase intensity until we get into that 3 year of tribulation and that great upheaval that is going to permit Antichrist to negotiate that covenant that starts the last 7 years. And so that's where you click in Matthew 24:9, where it says great affliction will happen, which is the same word thlipsis, which is tribulation. And that's the first tribulation, and that is after Babylon has come to full power, after scaring everybody through its false prophets of apocalypse and being destroyed from the face of the earth, sponsors an Antichrist, relatively unknown figure, to negotiate this covenant, and then begins the first true tribulation period in terms of all of the wrath that is going to take place for the first 3.5 years, and another one in the second 3.5 years. And so the tribulation before the start of the last 7 is not as intense. Birth pangs, understand that understanding. And so as we move through that 3.5 years of tribulation, now we're into the 6.5-year period of the 10 days of tribulation. 3.5 are left for the last tribulation period in the time of the reign of Antichrist. And this is the time that happens before the abomination, which is at the midpoint of the last 7 years when Antichrist is crowned. So everything again starts to fit, chronology-wise with what Jesus is telling us in Matthew 24. And you have the gospel being preached to the end of the earth, which is the 144,000, the 2 witnesses, and the 144,000 are part of the first fruits. So that goes right up to the midpoint of the last 7 years. And you also have this reign of Babylon that is going to prepare the way for Antichrist. And Babylon is going to have Antichrist as its star. That is rising within the governance of Babylon that oversees and controls the 10-nation empire until Antichrist gets so powerful at the midpoint in Revelation 17, where he partners with the 10 kings and they overthrow Babylon either at the midpoint or shortly thereafter. So again, in around that time of the abomination and in the time of the trumpets. And so hopefully we've given you some things today to think about in terms of who the 4 horsemen are, and we're going to talk more in part 2 of this in the next show. But if you want a document on part 1, get a hold of me at the Genesis6conspiracy.com and ask for the 4 horsemen part 1, and I will send you that document. So until next time, I'm signing off and hoping to see you again.